Mr. Peyton, as magnificent as this country is physically, aren't there those who find it difficult, if not impossible, to continue living in this climate of fear?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes.
Apartheid, the state of being apart. As an Afrikaans word, this represented the nation of South Africa from the years of 1948 to 1994. The harsh, racial segregation system ruled over the predominant black population. Therefore, chaos found its way into the lifestyle for non-whites in South Africa. With racial tensions before World War II, white nationalist leaders found ways to construct laws built off of xenophobia. The number of uprisings and protests started to increase, which mounted onto the country's turbulent racial mess. And this all happened in the world where this racist point of view was being erased. Apartheid was troubling. Apartheid was chaotic. Apartheid was a tragedy. To some extent, it broke the country apart. Nelson Mandela and other anti-apartheid leaders will make their way into this timeline of disorder and bring the ideas of peace and justice to South Africa. This is the story of apartheid. Racial tensions in South Africa began way before 1948. It all started when Europeans were exploring and finding an easier way to get to Asia on water. The Portuguese first settled in South Africa for maritime trading purposes, but the Dutch found its way to officially settle and eventually establish a colony in South Africa. The Dutch, referring to themselves as Afrikaners or Boers, made their own language and started colonizing all throughout the country. The British soon saw how having a colonized Cape was an advantage, and they soon had power in the colonies in 1806. Nearly 100 years later, the Dutch wanted to regain control of South Africa. Thus, the two countries went to war over the land and trading purposes. These were the Boer Wars, and it included a series of two wars. The Dutch won the first, while the British won the second in 1902. Therefore, white people were in control in a predominant black population. 11 years later, the first Prime Minister, Louis Botha, enforced the Natives Land Act of 1913. This act prohibited the native population to own land outside of the areas reserved for them. This was before apartheid. Soon after the Natives Land Act of 1913, the Afrikaner National Party, with an overwhelmingly white identification, was founded in 1915. During World War II, approximately 200,000 white men from South Africa were sent to fight the Nazis in Europe. Due to the predominant white workforce in South Africa, the country was witnessing a change where non-white Afrikaners suddenly grew to become the majority of the workforce. The white population soon became uncomfortable as the black population gradually moved into what was once a primarily white area. The foundations of apartheid were figured to have been built upon fear of losing Dutch culture or jobs, and the idea that one race has to be superior than the other. Apartheid's foundations paved the way for more separation and chaos throughout the nation than ever before. People of color lived completely different lives than white Afrikaners due to apartheid. Under the strict laws in place, they had to abide by countless regulations, which was the main reason why many protested. It all started with the addition of the controversial 1913 Land Act, which prohibited the people of color to leave the reserves or become sharecroppers. The predominant white-based National Party continued to place as many sanctions as possible on people of color to increase the racial inequality that was already growing. With the additions of multiple acts, life as people of color became even more difficult than it already was. For example, with the implementation of the Group Areas Act of 1950, which forced people of color to live in different areas than white Afrikaners, or the Separate Representation of Voters Act of 1951, which forced people of different races to go to different voting polls. It was clear that the National Party was trying their hardest to segregate white Afrikaners from the rest of the population, on top of segregating the white Afrikaners from all other groups of people in South Africa. The white Afrikaners were treated better and lived more luxurious lives. White Afrikaners were given the opportunity to buy larger and nicer properties. Additionally, they were offered higher skilled jobs, which ultimately led to colored people making up the majority of the hard-labored areas. This led to the colored people feeling that white Afrikaners controlled the workforce, and this ultimately led to tumultuous protests.
Demonstrations against the South African government's strict apartheid policies flare into shocking violence.
The Sharpeville Massacre, a chaotic and turbulent protest that occurred in reaction to the passed laws. Established in the year of 1960, the passed laws were a set of laws that required people of color to obtain a passport. With these laws having been ratified, this stimulated a group between 5,000 to 10,000 to protest at a police station in Sharpeville. Originally, the protest was seemingly peaceful, but soon the number was approximately up to 20,000, and the chaos gradually made its way to the presence, and the protest was no longer peaceful. The police opened fire on the protesters. 69 dead, 180 injured. Immediately, the nation reacted. They reacted by throwing more protests, and the country was in more disarray than it had ever been before. Another incident that highlighted the oppression against colored individuals in South Africa by the National Party was the Soweto uprising. The Soweto uprising took place on June 16th of 1976, where thousands of students who were forced to learn the language Afrikaans marched towards a soccer stadium right outside Johannesburg. Originally planned to be peaceful, police officers quickly turned a peaceful protest into a tragic accident by shooting into a crowd who resisted the suppression of the officers. This date became known as a clear example of how the National Party was trying their hardest to suppress any opposing views. Racial tension in South Africa was increasing as apartheid had been in place for more than 30 years. The United States was progressing, as well as other countries, and the nation was pressured. P.W. Botha led South Africa throughout the 80s, and everything seemed to be getting worse. In fact, nations around the world started to view the apartheid regime as a problem. United Nations called for sanctions on South Africa. In addition, the United States Congress proceeded to pass the Comprehensive Anti-Apartheid Act, which was created in order to guide the efforts of the United States in helping to bring an end to apartheid in South Africa and lead to the establishment of a non-racial democratic form of government. This led to banks and large international corporations to withdraw any connection they had with the country. Thus, South Africa was economically struggling. As South Africa continued to struggle throughout the modern era, countries around the world began to take notice. As the South African apartheid progressed throughout the years, sides began to form, and one man, Nelson Mandela, became the face of the movement opposing apartheid. After experiencing discrimination and racism from a group of white people, Mandela felt the need to do something. Thus, he joined the African National Congress and established a youth program. Being one of the more important members of the ANC, Mandela promoted peace and equality throughout South Africa and pushed for apartheid's eventual demise. However, with Nelson's main goal to abolish apartheid, he was sentenced to life in prison due to sabotage against the government. This occurrence outraged some of South Africa, only adding to the argument that an unjust government was in place and how someone's race can determine a punishment. P.W. Botha was pressured to open negations, and he eventually released Nelson Mandela in 1990.
There's Mr. Mandela, Mr. Nelson Mandela, a free man taking his first steps into a new South Africa.
People who led the way for a more egalitarian society in the midst of a dominating segregational system truly exemplified that a triumphant light can break through a gloom-ridden cloud of racism, injustice, and inequality. Following Nelson Mandela's release from prison in February of 1990, negotiations between the ANC and the South African government began to end the violence and racism occurring in the streets of the country. In 1991, progress was seen as both sides negotiated a new constitution with goals to end racism and establish a democratic style of government.
And I accordingly take great pleasure in announcing the election of Comrade Nelson Mandela to the post of president.
In 1994, South Africa held their first democratic election, with the first president being Nelson Mandela, the former anti-apartheid leader. Following the events of World War II, many African nations, including South Africa, sought independence from their European colonizers. In response to increased racial and discriminatory laws designed to subjugate and demoralize non-whites, Nelson Mandela led a fight for equal rights in South Africa. In November of 1993, almost 50 years later, political groups and individuals met in Kempton Park near Johannesburg, South Africa, to draft an interim constitution, officially ending apartheid and restoring racial stability to South Africa. The South African apartheid demonstrated both triumph and tragedy. Throughout the apartheid, many rules and regulations were placed that limited the rights that people of color contained. However, following the revolution begun by Nelson Mandela, the strict laws were put to rest as they were repealed in 1990, as well as Nelson Mandela being released from prison. Overall, the apartheid was also a triumph, as it represents us as a world community getting closer to racial equality. The apartheid opposition, led by Nelson Mandela, represents the reduction in racial inequality and inspires the fight to complete the balance of race today.